Reading from Whispers from Eternity, Whisper number 152. Teach me not to be deceived by the senses. O Divine Teacher, train me to recognize the difference between my soul's lasting happiness and the passing pleasures of the senses. Keep my eyes open that I be not deceived by my senses, decked out as they are in stolen royal trappings and in the mirage cloak of false happiness. As thus disguised, they try to enter the mansion of my life. Discipline my unwise wayward senses that my pleasures be spiritualized, and that I look ever beyond the illusion of glittering, visible forms to find divine joy hidden, simply dressed in the white robe of humility. Good morning, everyone. It's a joy to see more and more people in person as we are returning to more relaxed settings now. This is, of course, an interesting reading that we have today. A few weeks ago, we had a different verse from the Bhagavad Gita, the one where Krishna says, meditate on the divine, and if you cannot do acts of service, think of me while you're acting in this world. And if you cannot do that, and he goes through a list and he finally says, bring me your failures and I will receive them and reward you. It makes you, relax with a sigh of relief. And then we have this reading, the story of Judas, and this verse from the Gita, where Krishna presents this graphic warning. Pondering on sense objects leads to attraction, and attraction leads to desires, anger, and finally he says the loss of discriminative faculty. And it is quite a dire verse. And the story of Judas itself, it is perhaps the most dramatic and in some ways the saddest story in the Bible, because Judas was not a normal soul, as Swamiji writes in this reading. He was an extraordinary soul who was drawn to the inner circle of Jesus, and he had that good fortune and good karma, and yet, because of the same trajectory that Krishna describes in that verse, he falls. He falls down and he has to go through the fate of needing to suffer for that. It's almost, I think of that verse as this warning sign that, sometimes when you're in picnic spots near lakes or rivers, there's this danger sign, and you have things like whirlpools and torrents and rapids, and there's a figure of somebody drowning and a red day, exclamation mark and all of that. And sometimes, not always, you look at the water and you think, it doesn't look that bad. Are they sure they put this in the right place? But the people who put it there perhaps knew better. They have seen enough, they have known enough, and that's exactly what this verse is presenting for us. And Judas's example, and Swami writes in his commentary so beautifully, and even in the more detailed commentaries that he has written on this, he explains how this is the clear depiction of that verse from the Gita, his attraction to money, of how he's drawn to it, and then that leads to desires, and finally his discrimination is lost. Here is his teacher. Judas started on the right side of history. In the Western world, we almost think of Judas as the villain, in a sense, because one could say he was singularly responsible for the crucifixion of Christ and everything that happened. But at the same time, we have to remember that he started on the right side. He was committed to Jesus as a disciple, and he wanted Jesus to win. But there is this attraction to money. He was a thief also, and he had stolen, and that was not where the problem arose. It comes towards the end, because now his discrimination is lost. Here is his teacher, his master, who he knew was his guru, and he's telling him, the poor you not always have with you, and yet Judas cannot hear that. All that he thinks is, maybe I know better than Jesus. Maybe I know what is happening here, and that's when it all crumbles down, and we know what happens after that. I was reminded of a story from the Mahabharata. It's not one that people often mention or one that is commonly known. It is a story that happens 3 generations after the war of Mahabharata. As most of you know, it's a war between 2 clans of brothers, the good guys and the bad guys, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. But this story comes 2 generations after that. It is about the grandson of Arjuna. At the end of the war, the good guys win, the Pandavas, and then Yudhishthira, the eldest of the Pandava brothers, he ascends the throne as the king. And he rules for many, many decades. And Yudhishthira is this model of nobility, of righteousness, and he upholds Dharma in the best of ways, and everybody is happy in the kingdom. And he is followed by the grandson of Arjuna, his Yudhishthira's brother. Arjuna's son Abhimanyu dies in the war, but his wife was pregnant at that time, and she bears a son. His name is Parikshit, and he is the next successor to the throne after Yudhishthira decides to renounce the kingdom and walk away. And Parikshit is also an equally noble king. He's very righteous, and he is doing all the right things. But as we know, some of you know, there is also an historical event happening during this time of Mahabharata. The planet as a whole is going through a phase where it's descending in its consciousness from this very long period of time called Dwapara Yuga into this other period of time called Kali Yuga. For those of you that have read the autobiography of a yogi, all this might make more sense, even if not. It's just a period of 1200 years. Dwapara Yuga is a period of 2400 years, which we are back in again. And Kali Yuga is this darker material age that the planet was descending into at the time of the Mahabharata war, as the war was ending. And when Parikshit was ruling the kingdom, it was time for the transition to happen. And the way the story is told, Kali Yuga is personified as a person sent by Brahma, the creator, who enters the kingdom of Parikshit. And Kali walks into his court and says, I have come here by the will of the creator. My job is to now usher this darker age into this kingdom. I have to now dull people's consciousness and make them more materialistic. And of course, you can understand Parikshit was not very pleased. That's not what he wanted to hear. He wanted everybody to be happy. He wanted dharma. He wanted nobility. And he was a pious king himself. And then there are some negotiations that ensue. And after some discussions, Parikshit offers 4 places. Kali initially asks, I want to reside in your palace. And Parikshit says, no, you cannot. I will not allow that to happen because I don't want your energy here. And then after all this discussion, he offers 4 places where Kali can reside and he can be unchecked. And the 4 places that they agree on, the first one are places where liquor is served, where people consume alcohol and are inebriated because their discriminative faculties perhaps are already lost. And the second are brothels and places where people have promiscuous relationships and indulge in lustful temptations. And the third are slaughterhouses where people can blind their own natural feelings of kindness and compassion and act without mercy. And the fourth, places where people gamble, because these are places where people can be deceitful, they're treacherous, and they can be driven by self-interest to perform adharmic activities. So Parikshit says, how about you reside in these 4 places in my kingdom, and there you can grow unchecked and nobody will tell you anything. And Kali thinks about this and he says, okay, I will think about that. Certainly these seem to be obvious and good choices for me to be residing in. But he says, but you see, my job here is to usher a darker age. I have to make people more materialistic. And all these options that you've given me are already dull and darker in their consciousness in these places. There's not a lot of work for me to do here. So I really cannot do my job just by being confined to these places. So again, they go back and forth and they bargain even more. And Parikshit agrees to offer one other place that Kali asks where he can reside and where he will be unchecked. And that's how Kali Yuga is ushered. And that place that Kali asks for is gold. Kali says, can I reside in gold? Because that is handled by everyone. Now once I can get into it, now I can pervade all of your kingdom. And Parikshit, of course, is not pleased with that, but he also knows that he cannot stop this flow of nature itself. So he reluctantly agrees to it. And then, as again the story is told, that's how, as soon as he entered gold, he could affect people, he could infect them with this agency of greed. And from that point on, everybody who touched gold, they were infected by this attitude of greed. They wanted to hoard. They were now relying on this money for their own security and strength and power. And from that point on, like Krishna describes, this vortex starts to spin, going downward from desire to attraction, and again, ending at the complete loss of discriminative faculties. And this example is, of course, graphic. Krishna starts by talking about sense objects themselves. When we often find ourselves in one of these cycles, when we find ourselves in any of those phases, it's not often that obvious what sense object we started with, because it almost seems to imply that the pursuit of physical pleasures is the downfall of men. Yes, but it is not the entirety of what this verse in the Gita represents, because what Krishna is referring to by sense objects are not just the pleasures that we seek on this plane, but everything that draws us outside. They represent this outward pull of us believing that what we are seeking is somehow going to come from the world around us. And that drives us. And the desires become more and more subtle. They are not always as obvious as the desire for a bowl of ice cream or something as simple as that. The desire to be recognized, the desire to feel important, the desire to have power, the desire to be loved, the desire to feel connected, whatever it is. All the things that drive us every day, every minute of our lives, it's not often obvious, but if you think about it, if you meditate on it, you can pull it back. You will notice that it is somehow coming from those senses, because the senses are the key that draw the energy from our spine outside. The senses are that agency of the physical body that keep us from being settled in our own deeper spine. I enjoy Swami Kriyananda's Raj Yoga book, which I hope most of you have read. And this past week, I was reading a particular chapter, which I happen to be teaching. And it's both a complex and also a long text for this chapter. There's one line that caught my eye. Actually, many lines did, but this one, I don't know if I had noticed it before. And I think the line read, "Spiritual life begins only when we start drawing our energy into the deep spine." Now, that was fascinating in itself, but more than just the idea that he was presenting, I think my eyes were drawn to this word "only." I felt like I was hearing it for the first time, where Swami was saying spiritual life begins only when we start drawing our energy into the deeper spine. Because when we think of the senses, Yogananda, Master used to call them sense telephones, because they're always in this state of receptivity. Like, a telephone is just sitting there, but it's not just sitting there. It is sitting there, but it's constantly receiving a signal. If somebody called you, I'm sitting there as if we are living in the 1980s. Nowadays, it sits in our pocket. But just imagine one of those things, if you're all old enough to do. I've seen them in the movies. Honestly, I've never done that. But it's there on the desk as if it's doing nothing, as if it's a stationary object, but it's in a state of receptivity. It's constantly waiting for the signal. It's constantly waiting to see who's going to call. I'm going to ring as soon as I get a call. I was watching this documentary recently, and it was one of those medical documentaries about the human body and such. And I think the title of the documentary, I don't exactly remember it right now, but it was about the reactive process, how the human nervous system functions. So I was immediately tempted to click on it. And how these things are so beautifully represented graphically these days, different blood vessels and heart and stomach. They just have these beautiful visuals of what the human body looks like, but not with all the unpleasantness, but as if it was just this clean room with all these different things going on. And they had these representations of the brain and the nervous system and the different impulses. And the narrator was talking about neurons themselves as cells, the cells that make up our nervous system. And he was saying most cells in the body are contained. They have a cell wall, and they're generally round in shape. Neurons, on the other hand, are not. Neurons are, first of all, they have a very odd shape. They just have the center from which these thousands of hairs spring out. And these are hairs, I don't know if there's another word for it. They connect them with all these other neurons. And these connections are called synapses. And of course, there are billions and billions of neurons in the body, and each neuron can have thousands and thousands of synapses. On an average, a neuron is said to have 1,000 synapses. And trust me here, a neuron apparently is also a much smaller cell than most other cells in the body. So we are talking about these really tiny things that obviously we cannot see with our naked eye, and each one of these is connected with thousands of other neurons. And I think it said just in the cerebral cortex of the brain, there are 125 trillion synapses that connect and network. And obviously, all these are just fascinating facts. How does this come back to desires and attraction and attachment and all of this? As I was watching those tiny cells with all these thousands of hairs in every direction, that visual in itself was so powerful, because I could just see every pulsating neuron that's constantly waiting for these chemical signals and electric pulses. They're constantly in the state of seeking and receptivity, thousands of them with every cell and billions of cells in the body. This is the design of nature. This is not a confusion that we got ourselves into. This is not something that just happened because we got misguided or we were misinformed, that somehow we were drawn to this sense object or that desire or this. But this is the essential design of how we are made. And as Swami Kriyananda says, spiritual life begins when we start reversing this flow of energy, because this whole example illustrates more than anything else, it cannot be done overnight. You cannot tell the neurons, just stop listening. Stop constantly seeking these impulses. Stop constantly reacting to everything that you're seeing, everything you're touching, everything you're feeling. Can you just stay still? But that's not so easy, and all of us, I'm assuming, practice or have practiced in some form and with some regularity meditation, and we know it's not always all that simple. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna presents this image of a tortoise pulling all its limbs, its 5 limbs and its head into its shell, and he talks about how the yogi pulls all of his senses into his shell, into his spine, and that is the process of meditation. And it's a powerful image, one that I recommend you to meditate on. I personally do, to think of that tortoise as consciously pulling. And as I was thinking about it yesterday, I realized how appropriate that image is. There's so many other images that Krishna could have given, Be like the bear that goes hibernating in the winter, goes into its cave and just, shuts the door of the cave of its own making. But he doesn't say that. He talks about the tortoise because it's conscious. It's consciously pulling its limbs inside. We cannot go into that cave and shut the doors and hope that we will go into that state of meditation, that the energy can be drawn into the deep spine. This is a constant process. This is the spiritual life. It begins when we start reversing that energy, when we become aware that pondering on sense object springs attraction. And from that grows desire. I think I was 7 or 8 years old. We used to have these comic books in India with different spiritual saints and great souls and their stories, and very simply told for children. And I remember reading the one on Buddha, the life of Buddha, how Buddha was married, he was a king, he had all the luxuries. His father did not want him to be exposed to any suffering in the world. And finally, one night, he sneaks out. He wants to see what's outside of the palace, and then he sees this aging man, he sees the dying man, and he comes face to face with this reality of death. And then he realizes there's more to this world than I knew. And then he goes into meditation, and it said he attained enlightenment. And then he comes out and gives his first sermon, which I don't know what he exactly said then. But one of the things apparently that he said, which was thousands of years ago, was that desire is the root cause of all suffering. And I was this boy reading this comic, but I thought, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. We are constantly wanting something, we are seeking it, we are going crazy trying to find that outside. Obviously, we are going to suffer. And as consistent as that idea is, it is not always easy to practice, because we have this power of the ego that is invested in defending what we think of as our own birthright, all these desires that we want to hold. As much as this idea just seems so self-evidently true, desire is the cause of all suffering. And yet, why do we suffer? Because it is not all that obvious, because there is this design of nature. The ego is going to send all its warriors to defend with all its heart, mind, and soul every single desire that we want to hold on to. And that is the battlefield of the Mahabharata. Again, in another section of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna asks Krishna this almost poignant question where he says, "My Lord, how is it, why is it that against my own will, knowing very well that this is not in my best interest, I act in wrong ways as if compelled, as if I'm being compelled to act, to do things that are not in my own best interest?" And then there's this famous answer that Krishna gives in this verse that some of you may have heard. Desire it is, passion it is, born of the ego-activating quality of nature. It inflicts anger upon men. And, O Arjuna, know this to be the all-devouring enemy of mankind on this planet. It's this powerful proclamation that Krishna gives, again, just similar to what he's saying in this verse. Desire it is, passion it is. We live in a world right now where some of these things are even glorified in a sense. Self-indulgence is considered, a birthright, that somehow telling somebody that they cannot indulge in things that they're drawn to is not even right. And here are these teachings that are telling that it is desire and passion that are the enemy of our own happiness. The word passion itself is an interesting one because you read the description of anybody that is successful in any field, any bio, any resume, one of the words you'll find in the first two sentences is passionate. He was a passionate chef, passionate artist, passionate entrepreneur. Now, there are a lot of layers and connotations to it. I'm not trying to be critical of that idea itself. Of course, you want to be committed to whatever it is that you're doing and follow it with all your heart, which is what most often people are saying. But again, in the culture that I come from, especially in the Indian languages, and also most often how English is used, the word passion does not have as much of a positive connotation as it might do in the West, because we live in a culture where it almost seems self-evidently right to be pursuing everything we want to pursue, to feel right about all the things that we feel are valid, all our opinions, all our beliefs, to be defending them, to be pursuing them, and glorifying them. And here is where there is this subtle teaching, the story of Judas, and we are talking about sense objects, but we are not. We are quite far from that. This is about the ego defending everything that is not in our own best interest. And this defense that is impermeable in some way, because that is the nature of who we are. That is how this energy is all set. And that beautiful chant that Bira chanted for us, desire my great enemy. I always enjoy, and it's a pleasure to know that Biraj is going to chant because he picks the right chants for every reading. And that chant, it goes on to say, pranayam is the wishing tree, pranayam is your religion, pranayam is creator Lord. We are not talking about alternate nostril breathing and measured count breathing. I mean, yes, of course, all these techniques of yoga, but in essence, what we are talking about is reversing this flow of energy, not just in meditation, but as the reading says, with respect to delusion as we move through this world, to be aware that every object here is designed to make our senses gaze, to spring that attraction in us, and being watchful and careful. There was this recent controversy in news about a Catholic institution. I won't go into the details of it because I don't even know enough to have an opinion about it, but I was reading this very scathing critique of this person in New York Times about this lady who was canonized as saint, and she was running a convent, and how it was a cult. And she used very strong words, which we have to pay attention to, like coercion, abuse, and all of that. And I was going through some of the examples in her own words. They were talking about how they were asked, the women nuns were asked not to linger around children. They were asked to cut off all their ties with their family. Chastity was taken to an extreme extent. They were supposed to not have any human relationships, including friendships. And of course, that all sounds extreme as an act of renunciation. But if you think about it, it could be well-meaning. There could be a context in which this could be seen as a way for protecting us from being gazing at the senses. What was interesting to me in that article was how easy, how common it is for us to have this rebellion to all of this and say, that is unfair, this is not right. How could you ask me not to linger around children? How could you do that? That is the most poignant of things. How can this be right? Well, If you do linger, the children are not sense objects. That's why desires are subtler than we think they are. They're, after all, children, but they can spring in our hearts. If you are a young lady who has embraced that form of renunciation, it is likely to spring that desire in your heart, and then there will be all these other steps that follow. As Yogananda ji said once when Swami was talking to him about somebody who was very kind and generous but not drawn to God, not believing in God, Yogananda's remark was, the road to Hades is paved with good intentions. Hades, is, I think, is another word for hell. And the first few times I heard that line, it did not make a whole lot of sense to me. I didn't know what he was talking about. But what he's referring to is exactly this vortex. We don't start off by saying, I'm going to indulge, I'm going to do all the things that are going to ruin my discrimination. We have good intentions, but when we lack the pole star, when we do not know where to tie it all, when we do not have the system where we can relate and offer everything up to the divine, then it is the road to Hades. Again, Yogananda ji said when he was addressing a small group of monks, some of you will fall off from the spiritual path, but it needn't be so if you could stay in tune. If you could stay in tune. That was his word. What does that mean? It is simply what Judas was going through when Jesus was telling him, the poor you always have with you, maybe to stop and wonder, is there some truth in there? Is there something for me to listen to? The problem, of course, starts by gazing on sense object, but it ends with this ruin of spiritual life because it affects our discriminative faculty. Swami is kind in his translation. Most translations translate the verse of the Gita, which is actually how it's written. It says, when the discriminative faculty is lost, everything is ruined. And Swami says it is the annihilation of spiritual life, which is both more accurate and a better way of stating it. But in a sense, everything is ruined because we have lost our sense of objectivity. Now ego has taken charge. Now there's no way to know what is right, what is wrong. And the only way we can navigate it is to try and be in tune, to be able to ask, is there some truth in that? Is there some truth in what Yogananda said? Is there some truth in what Swami Kriyananda wrote? Is there some truth in this thing that 4 of my friends are telling me I might be confused about? And then stop and ponder. If we could be in tune, we don't need to fall, and all these experiences, in a way, I didn't finish the story of Judas, of course, I'll probably end with that. Yogananda ji also said, probably not as well known to most people, that Judas, in fact, was reborn in this last century, and he was a disciple of Ramakrishna. His name was Swami Sharadananda. And Yogananda ji said, in this lifetime, he was, in fact, liberated. And apparently, Swami Sharadananda himself had this quirky way of handling money. He always held on to finances and accounting of the organization and all of that. And when disciples would make fun of him or tease him about his practices and his attachment, Ramakrishna would tell them, don't tease him for that. He has suffered enough for his attachment toward money. So, as much as we fall, next week we'll talk about how devotees rise. But just to leave it on a high note, this fall that we are talking about needn't be so. And even when we do, just going back to that other comforting verse from the Gita, we bring back our failures to Krishna, to the divine, to the Guru, to God, and they will take it, they will reward us with spiritual progress, and we will be able to come back, and some avatar will step in to come and liberate us. So, God bless you all.
I've passed my life as a stranger, Lord, roamed far in foreign lands, far, Lord, far, too far. Only he who knows he's far from home, only he, Lord, understands. Only he who knows he's far from home feels the earth and understands. Sometimes a stranger did take me in, then love I thought was near. Love, Lord, where is love? As the winds upon the desert sand whisper hope, then disappear. As soft winds breathe on the desert sand, so love sighs, then disappears. Sometimes a child laughed, and I did pause, and dreamed of joys at home. Joys, Lord, only a dream. For what joy is there without your love? Empty like an ocean foam. For what joy is there without your smile? You're the sea, all else is foam. How long must I be a wanderer, Lord? You know where I belong. You know, Lord, yes, you know. Home is where my love's pure presence is. I've grown tired of strangers' songs. Home is where my Lord's sweet presence is. Bless me that I hear your song.